Let's talk about absolute contraction targets. And let's use our friends at Formula Pharma as an example. So we want to talk about absolute contraction targets for scopes 1, 2, and 3. This slide looks a little bit at the numbers and the math around target setting and uses them as an example. So you can see here that the methodology that they're considering for scope 1 and 2 is absolute contraction, and for scope 3 is also absolute contraction. For scope 1 and 2, they're targeting a 42% absolute reduction target, which is required by SBTI. For scope 3, they have a little bit more flexibility around the ambition level that they choose, and they are looking to set a well below 2-degree target aligned. So in this case, they're looking to reduce absolute emissions by 25%. If you look at your own targets based on your base year and your target year and your most recent year, that well below 2 degrees scenario may be more or less than 25%, but for Formula Pharma, we're seeing 25% reduction at that ambition level. So specifically within PG&S and upstream transportation and distribution, they have 38,500 tons of CO2 equivalent in their base year. And if they reduce that by 25% absolute reduction, they're left with a total of 28,875 tons of CO2 equivalent. So that's the absolute reduction required for scope 1 and 2 and for scope 3. There are two options that they can take toward this target. One thing I'll note here is that when they set these targets and have them validated by SBTI, the scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 targets will be tracked separately. And so the options 1 and 2 for target wording are really just about how they communicate this externally, but recognize that internally they'll need to track the progress separately, as well as report separate progress to SBTI. The reason that they could combine the language and they have these two options is because they're using absolute contraction. So they could either combine their scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 to have a simplified combined absolute target, or they can keep them separate. In option 1, Formula Pharma decides to split out scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 separately. And you can see here the language that says Formula Pharma commits to reducing absolute scope 1 and 2 emissions 42% and scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services and upstream transportation and distribution by 25% from 2030 by 2030 from a 2021 base year. This target option highlights the increased ambition of scope 1 and 2 and aligns the target language with how the targets will be tracked and reported on, which can simplify annual communications. In option 2, you can see that they've elected to combine scope 1, 2, and 3 targets into one target for communicating. And they have here that Formula Pharma commits to reduce absolute scope 1, 2, and 3 greenhouse gas emissions from purchased goods and services and upstream T&D 33.1% by 2030 from a 2021 base year. You can see that that is more simplified, and there's only one number that you're disclosing, and communicating this target could be a little bit simpler for external stakeholders, but I will note that you'll have to track and report on the emissions separately as well. You can see where we got that 33.1% from above in the table, and that is just essentially combining the absolute reduction required when you add up the scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions together. These percentage reduction points will be a little bit different based on each company, but in our example with PPL, you can see how these break down, and those reduction percentages, especially if you combine the targets, will change based on the relative share of scope 1 and 2 versus scope 3 emissions. For our example here with Formula Pharma, their scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 emissions are almost 50% each. And so that's why that 33.1% is kind of right in the middle of the scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 target ambition. Thanks for tuning in.